ever since the beginning of 2020, I've been on a mission to beat 100 video games every single year, and immediately after finishing each game, I rank it among every other game I've beaten. Not by objective quality or historical importance or any of that stuff, but simply based on how much I personally enjoyed it. So now that November is over, it's time to look back at the 5 games I completed this month and tell you where they landed on the rankings and why. So let's jump in at number 5 with Slitterhead. When I review games, I try really hard not to use inflammatory language like trash, worthless, horseshit, etc. But when I was yelling at my screen playing this game, I said all of those things about it, and I meant every word. This is the new action horror title from Bokeh Game Studios, a brand new development team founded by the creator of Silent Hill, and on paper it actually has a lot of really good ideas. Imagine a game where you can play as a spirit that can possess anyone on the street, and a few of those people have special latent abilities that allow them to use their own blood as all kinds of weapons and tools. This spirit has no memory, but instinctively knows that within the city there are scores of horrible monsters masquerading as regular humans and secretly preying upon the weak, and it's your job to seek them out and eradicate them. Sounds pretty cool, right? Now imagine that whoever had all these amazing ideas hired a team that was dead set on sabotaging the production and releasing the most uninspired, tedious, boring, broken experience imaginable. Some of its visuals are interesting, but in a time where any random dude in a basement could make a game with good graphics, Slitterhead's stilted art design makes its characters look like some sideways take on Team America World Police. Earlier I called this an action horror title, but the truth is there is absolutely no real horror at all, and using the word action anywhere near this game is extremely generous and borderline false advertising. As cool as the general idea is, 95% of the plot is spooned out to you in the form of these non-voiced nothing cutscenes where a character's just sitting on a couch and you just read about what they're thinking. And that written dialogue just keeps coming whether it's needed or not. This is probably the worst example I've ever seen of a game that just will not let you play for more than 10 seconds without interrupting you. Literally, when you start a mission, it's like, okay, let's read 2 paragraphs of dialogue about stuff we already knew, then you can take 5 steps, then 2 more useless lines of dialogue like, I bet she's down this alleyway, then 4 more steps, 5-second cutscene, more dialogue, a couple more steps, another mini cutscene, and it just never ever stops. The only time you're ever let loose at all is during the usually short combat sequences, and even then the combat is frustratingly imprecise, the lock-on system gives you no control whatsoever, and almost all of those cool abilities are actually less effective than just mashing attack until the enemy dies. There are, I believe, 5 enemy types in the entire game that you just have to fight over and over and over, and one of them is the boss. That's right, there are dozens of boss fights in this game, and all but about 3 of them are the same basic thing with pretty much exactly the same tired moveset every time, and those other 3 bosses are just humans. The way the story wraps up is somehow both nonsensical and predictable, but honestly, by that point I was so exhausted with even having to slog through it that I wasn't really listening anymore. It is incredibly rare for me to argue that a game is just objectively better off not existing, but I swear to God, it seems like they were trying to make the worst game possible when they released this disaster. Coming in at number 4 this month, we have Kirby Super Star. Playing these in order of release, this is the 5th Kirby game I've managed to beat, and this franchise is kind of middle of the road for me up to that point, but Super Star is probably the best one so far. So why is it also my least favorite? There's nothing to dislike about the basic format, even though most of the game is still pretty standard Kirby 2D platforming. Breaking the experience into several smaller games, each with their own unique spin on the formula, is way more engaging than Kirby has ever been before. You have more abilities to steal from enemies than ever here, and a lot of them are so powerful you can essentially insta-kill some of the bosses with them, although there were a few boss fights that were still pretty tough and a lot of fun. And those game types that aren't just platforming take some big swings and for the most part pay off. I mean, you've got a boss rush in here, a collect-a-thon, and even kinda sorta almost a Metroidvania with Milky Way wishes, because you sometimes have to backtrack to unlock abilities you may have missed so you can break down barriers and proceed with the game. But here's where Superstar starts to lose me, even though none of these decisions are necessarily bad. When I picked up my controller to start this, I was looking forward to what Kirby has always been up to this point. A nice, breezy, fairly easy side-scroller where knowing what to do and where to go is never an issue. But a couple of these games just aren't like that, and you have to be very thorough in exploring the levels or you risk having to circle back and replay them, and I don't like to replay anything. It's fully a preference thing, but I don't usually like not knowing what to do in a game. It's okay if it's hard, but I'd like it to be clear. If I'd known what this was going into it, I probably would have been a lot more mentally prepared to deal with it, or perhaps perhaps I wouldn't have tried it at all. But as it played out, I was just annoyed by the curveballs it kept throwing me, and unfortunately this entry turned out to probably be the best in the series so far objectively, but also the one I enjoyed the least. I know that isn't fair and it means I'm kind of a baby, but that's the kind of gamer I am, honestly. I don't have a lot of patience for games that make me replay content, even if everyone else loves it. This is one of the few reviews of mine that I will own as a bad take, but at the end of the day, I have to rank these by how much I enjoyed them, and I didn't really enjoy this very much because of my own personal failings as a gamer. Next up at number 3, it's Mafia 2 Definitive Edition. I'm playing through these games now so I can be all caught up before the new Mafia game releases next year, and I loved the definitive edition of Mafia 1, but this second installment didn't quite make it to love status. The first Mafia game really impressed me because contrary to my expectations, it didn't just try to be another GTA clone, but it brings something different and very valuable to the table instead. Mafia 1 is a much more cinematic narrative experience than GTA, with less over-the-top action, but a lot more nuance with the world they've built and the characters that live in it. So I came away from that game really impressed and expecting the same from the sequel, but there ended up being a few reasons that didn't exactly happen. First, and probably most importantly, the story in the sequel takes forever to really get moving. I'm talking like halfway through before it even starts to get good. The original did a great job of getting me invested in the plot right out the gate by making every mission meaningful and weaving in important character interactions throughout via the excellent cutscenes. But with only 2 or maybe 3 exceptions, the first half of the Mafia 2 missions are just go here, drop this off, go there, kill this guy, mission complete, etc., with almost no significant story movement. It did eventually take off, and the last 40% of the game's story is about as good as the first one, but that initial 60% not being up to snuff heavily affected my final view of the game as a whole. Now, the rest of my issues are a direct result of the fact that unlike Mafia 1 Definitive Edition, Mafia 2 is not a ground-up remake, but rather a simple remaster that just touches up the visuals and audio. I don't really care about the graphics, but the gunplay is straight out of 2010, and it is rough. The auto-aim is always either way too good or completely MIA, and it feels like Vito's downed an entire bottle of hooch anytime you manually aim your piece at anything. And the driving is already less fun than something like GTA, so do we really need things like traffic laws and speeding tickets to bog down the action even further? In the remake of the original, that stuff was all turned off by default and you had to opt in if you wanted to bother with it, but here it's unavoidable and irritating. Finally, the outdated checkpoint system can be brutal. I found myself having to meander through entire buildings and mow down 20, 30 people before the game finally saves. And it's alarmingly easy to die in a split second if you make a wrong turn or the shoddy cover system craps its pants, which happens all the time. But even with all these distractions, the game overall is decent and absolutely worth playing for the story, but I do hope that when I play Mafia 3 sometime in early 2025, I have a much smoother ride in store for me. Moving on to number 2, we've got Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. I've now finished every Metal Gear game since MGS1, and I'll admit I have a rocky history with this franchise, but I have to say, this is one of my very favorites. Historically, I've been conflicted because I love the stories, but I've always found the gameplay to be clunky and frustrating, especially when playing the first few games. But MGS5 has taken those usual hills and valleys and flipped them upside down. The gameplay succeeds in being much more modern and manageable without losing that unique tactical espionage quality it's always had. This really shines during the stealth segments, and the game is truly at its best when you're crawling around, scoring silent headshots and ducking one close call after another. But as fun as all of this is, it's dampened slightly by the obvious fact that the story isn't nearly as crazy or Kojima-like. My understanding is that Kojima left sometime during production, but I don't know when or what they finished after he left or any of those details. You can just tell that some of the plot doesn't have that special, insane quality you're used to in a Metal Gear game. In fact, at times it seemed like there was very little story at all, and the focus remained strictly on completing missions, although I know now that by killing a certain scantily clad NPC, I may have inadvertently eliminated some of that story myself. All in all, Phantom Pain had very different highs and lows than what I'm accustomed to for this series, but as someone who ultimately favors gameplay over story, the good outweighed the bad enough to make this my favorite Metal Gear game ever. Except for Revengeance.
Nanomachine, son!
And finally, my favorite game that I beat in the month of November is none other than the amazing Trek to Yomi. I went into this knowing nothing about it other than the art style, and that was enough to get me interested, but there's a lot more here to love and a couple little things that weren't so lovable. Let's start with the grainy black and white elephant in the room. I've never actually sat down and watched a Kurosawa film, but from what little I have seen, it sure looks like they nailed the visual presentation. I don't usually go in for those optional retro filters that add CRT scan lines, sepia tones, etc., but the old school film grain that comes by default makes the otherwise unremarkable graphics pop like I never would have imagined. The story gets a lot crazier than what I was expecting, but it still delivers a classic tale of love and revenge straight out of some Shakespearean tragedy, and a few of the more emotional moments hit like a truck. The actual gameplay isn't nearly as perfect as the presentation, but it's still a mostly satisfying experience. Think of it as a simpler, two-dimensional version of Ghost of Tsushima. Between the light and heavy attacks, the various ranged options, and the parry system, the slower combat almost has a Souls-like feel to it, although in general, I wouldn't place this in that category at all. Now, most of the problems come along with that 2D aspect. You're stuck on a line the whole time while your enemies can adjust their depth, so I would occasionally lunge forward with my sword only to find that my intended target isn't actually directly in front of me. And since you can't circle your attackers, it was very common to get immediately surrounded and have no quick way to recover. Even something as simple as turning your ass around was overly complicated. Lastly, even at over 2 years old, there are still a few bugs present that really spoil the fun, like sometimes the enemies would just stop attacking and wouldn't start again until I completely restarted the game. So yeah, unfortunately there were a few bumps in the road on my way to Yomi, but the trek itself is still solid enough to make it an easy recommendation if you're in the mood for a modestly sized, challenging action game with an excellent story and outstanding visuals. Well, that wraps up the month of November, and even though we didn't beat that many games this month, it still brings us to a total of 101 games beaten in 2024, so that's now 5 straight years that we've accomplished this goal. And it brings us to a grand total of 548 games since we started doing all this way back at the beginning of 2020. I always appreciate those of you that hit that like button if you made it this far, and next month we'll be playing Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Gears 5, Lorelei and the Laser Eyes, and much, much more. So feel free to subscribe if you want to see what takes the top spot in December.